Welcome to Cognation. I'm your host, Rolf Nelson.
And I'm Joe Hardy. Our guest on this episode is Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris. Dr. Carhart-Harris is the Ralph Metzner Distinguished Professor of Neurology and Psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco, where he heads up a lab that focuses on human neuroscience and psychopharmacology. Robin is best known for his groundbreaking research on how psychedelic substances affect the brain and how they could be used as treatments for mental health issues such as depression. And for my money, Robin is simply the world's leading expert on the effects of psychedelics on the mind and brain. Robin, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me on, Joe. Yeah, good to be with you guys.
Robin, we wanted to start off by asking you a little bit about, your background, in terms of what you studied in school and how you got interested in the area that you're focused on now.
Sure, gosh, school.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, let's see now. I wasn't particularly studious at school, but when I discovered psychology, apart from apart from physical education, and yeah, that was a topic, and I guess science as well in my teens that I really felt drawn to for the first time, a topic that I actually enjoyed learning about. My in the UK, it'd be A levels, pre-university. One of those was psychology, the other one sociology, and then chemistry. You might see a certain combination there and how it might make sense here. But yeah, I was deeply drawn to wanting to understand the mind, and then in time, drawn to understanding the brain. And even though there were a few missteps here and there, I was initially enrolled to do a degree in biochemistry that just didn't quite do it for me. I really wanted to be learning about the brain. The things just didn't really fall in my favor, and I led towards doing that biochemistry degree. I dropped out of, and then was lucky enough to go again and did a psychology degree. And after that, I'd long been interested in depth psychology, so psychoanalysis, the likes of Sigmund Freud and later Carl Jung and others. Um, and so I was enrolled to do a master's in, I think, experimental psychology or applied psychology, and went to the first lecture, and it wasn't fun. And it was stats heavy, and I was really, drawn towards the blood and guts of human nature. And I noticed that there was another master's program in psychoanalysis. So I inquired about that. I went to the first lecture. It was on totem and taboo, Freud's totem and taboo, fascinating paper on the origin of human consciousness, a hypothesis about that. Um, and I was sold, and so I changed my master's to psychoanalysis. And then during studying psychoanalysis, I was in a seminar one day, and was the topic of the seminar was ways to access the unconscious mind. And so we went through dreaming and bungled action, slips of the tongue, free association, even the pressure technique that Freud used early on, touching the forehead, now you'll remember kind of thing. Talk about priming. And or inducing maybe false memory, I don't know. But anyway, when you're left with those options, they just seem deeply flawed and limited. And so it helped explain, in a sense, why psychoanalysis was so fringe and not, generally regarded as science. And so I asked, what about a drug? If this thing exists and we're all here because maybe we have a hunch that it does exist, meaning the unconscious mind, then we need something better than, if dreams is the royal road, then, I think we can do a little better given, um, errors in recollection. All the dream reports come after you wake up and memories are vague and so on. So what about a drug? And so this, the seminar leader was like, oh, how interesting. And I was like, okay, what next? And So it sort of lingered as a thought, and as soon as I got back to my on-campus room, I looked this up and found Stan Grof's book, Realms of the Human Unconscious.
Mm.
That was a pivotal, I would say, life moment. Was, oh my goodness, there is this, and the subtitle of that book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, Studies with LSD, I think it is, or Human Studies with LSD. And I was just like, oh wow, and then I got that book out of the library. I devoured it, probably scribbled all over it, which is what I tend to do. And yeah, and which has got me banned from libraries before, but not something to be proud of. But yeah, that was a pivotal moment. And then, discovering that literature, I then became very single-minded, like a monomania in a sense, and I went looking for somewhere in the UK to do a PhD on psychedelics, and through some Google searching, I found two names that seemed promising. One was David Nutt at the University of Bristol, running a psychopharmacology unit, and the other one was a lady, literally a lady, sort of aristocracy. Uh, Amanda Fielding of the Beckley Foundation, and wrote to them both, and things came together. And I did get my foot in the door to do a PhD with David and his group. It wasn't strictly sort of entirely focused on psychedelics. It was actually focused on MDMA and its impact on the brain, on serotonin functioning, using sleep as an index of that. But it was, said to me sort of implicitly that this was about me getting my foot in the door. And if I bided my time, then maybe I could get to do what I really wanted to do, which was human functional brain imaging with psychedelics. That's how it all started for me.
Interesting. So, in that context of that work, if you don't mind me asking, did you have personal experiences with psychedelics, and how did that impact, if at all, your interest and study of the
Mm.
topic?
Well, it did. I left that out, and my policy is to be intentionally vague on it. So if it's all right with you,
Yeah, of
I'll
course.
be intentionally vague and say I had some experiences. I was a curious young man, curious teenager, and that curiosity, you know, drew me into an interest in the mind and these compounds. Yeah,
No, we won't force you. We won't force your hand on this one.
that's all good. That was vague, so it sort of works, and you don't have to edit that out.
And I want to get to a lot of evidence that you found for effectiveness of these drugs. But first, I'm really interested in the idea that your study was in the area of psychotherapy at first. So that sort of laid some groundwork for the way that you think about these things. So I wonder if you could say something about how you conceptualize what the unconscious mind is. Is it do you think of it as an active agent? In a sense that Freud thinks about the mind repressing and having certain defense mechanisms. Do you think about it as sort of the accumulation of all of the biases that we have in everyday life, or what's your conception of the unconscious, and how does that play into the way that psychedelics might access it?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the unconscious is an umbrella construct. So that means a lot falls under it, which means that it's going to have a few different aspects and will, with that umbrella qualifier, that it's abstract. So it's not as concrete and pinned down as other, constructs and phenomena in the world. And maybe with that specific term, the unconscious, it, it's created a bit of a problem for people in terms of understanding what it is, because it's very hard and specific in saying it's about things that you're not fully conscious of. If that was true, absolutely, then we could never get to know it, and we just have to give up. So it's not that. Um, it's not as strict as that, because the unconscious can become conscious and can impact on our thinking and behavior in ways that, sure, we're often unconscious of. And so that influence is implicit. Um, and yes, you brought up repression in psychoanalysis. That would be the dynamic unconscious, the sort of pushing out of conscious awareness, things that, again, a psychoanalytic term, are maybe ego dystonic, or um, unwelcome to the ego, to the conscious mind,
Hmm.
and self schema. How we think of ourselves. Um, Maybe injuries and adverse experiences, psychological injuries, and adverse experiences that we've had in our life, um, are the kind of things that can get pushed out of conscious awareness, so repressed. So the unconscious, I tend to think of as a system, and this is where we start to focus in and get a bit more specific, and more specific to the question, how do I think of it? Um, as a system. And in Freud's work, you see this evolution into him referring to it as the system unconscious that later became what he called the it. And then in the English translation, that,
I
you
so
know,
IT, not id. So
yeah,
IT, not
IT,
ID.
yeah,
IT. Okay.
the it, let's see, das S in
Right.
German. As distinct from das Ich, so the I. So Freud never used the words ego. Is that maybe Greek, ancient Greek? And id. He used the it and the I, the letter for self, the personal pronoun I. And so people say, Freud has more poetry in German, and it was a little more, you could say, specific and less sort of abstract. Um, so that system unconscious became the it. And that's how I think of it. I think of it as a primitive mode of consciousness, a system, you know, governed by, uh, dependent on a primitive mode of brain function that, as we evolved as a species, became, it remains core to who we are and what we are, but became overridden by this um, hyper-associative and analytical mode of mind that comes with what we now refer to as ego, and the capacity to self-reference, to have a sense of self, to have a quality of consciousness that is distinct from other species. I could commit to that claim. Um, Underneath that is this more primitive mode that I would associate with the system unconscious, and the functioning of that system. So there are other terms in psychoanalytic psychology, and more specifically Freudian metapsychology, that are relevant. And one of them is primary process thinking, which Freud associated with the dream state and other altered states, and that mode of thinking, of cognition, is what he would associate with the system unconscious. Um, so this is where this is probably my favorite aspect. I like a lot about psychoanalysis. I like the poetry, but I also like how Freud was thinking mechanistically. He was trained as a neurologist and was a physician, and trained with quite an eminent neurologist. So he was kind of thinking anatomically and mechanistically, and I can see that kind of undercurrent throughout his work, and I've taken quite a lot from it. Of course, he was writing at the end of the 19th century, into the early 1900s. So what do we know about the brain then? Not that much. We were just starting to feel our way in the dark.
One of the things you mentioned too is about dreams being a way that Freud talked about accessing the unconscious, or the royal road to the unconscious. And um, another perspective on what dreams are doing. Alan Hobson talks about dreams as being essentially the synthesis of random firings in the brain. That the origin is not an active unconscious, but just a random process, and this gets integrated in some sort of way.
Yeah, happy to comment on that. I mean, Alan Hobson, I got to know um, uh, when I was in London. He befriended Carl Friston, and so I got to know him a little bit in person. And Alan Hobson was an inspiration early on for me, reading popular neuroscience books. He had one called The Drug Dream Store, I think it was. Does that work, or The Dream Drugstore? Maybe that works better. Which had some playful ideas about the action of LSD in there, and that maybe the LSD or the psychedelic state is like a waking dream. So, yeah, Hobson was, in a sense, giving me some stuff, some clues, but I fundamentally disagreed with him on his view of Freudian psychology. Um, you know, it's a
And many
classic.
people do. I know it's certainly not
Yeah.
consensus at all. So
No, it's not, and I don't think it will stand the test of time. That dreams are random and have no. He even contradicts himself. He's written books on his own dreams that are very thick with, you know, emotion and personal significance. I just think, I mean, it's a classic one that psychoanalysis gets criticized for, which is,
mm.
when psychoanalysis says, "Oh, there's something going on in the domain of like denial," or um, then it's like, well, you can't win, and it's a tautology, and of course it would claim that. But I can't help but feel that a lot of that's going on with Alan. I know a little bit about his background, and early on, I think some psychoanalytic interactions quite offended him personally.
Mm.
So I think he has a certain personal, emotional bugbear with psychoanalysis, and I don't agree with the view that if you can identify some midbrain nuclei that are involved in the processes of rapid eye movement sleep, you can then extrapolate from that to say that all dreams are meaningless noise. It just doesn't follow. Uh,
Well, I do
uh,
remember. I do remember. It was at the Tucson Consciousness Conference one year when Alan Hobson spoke, and I think it was against Mark Solms, who
yeah,
is a Freudian
yeah,
inclined, and um, they polled the audience before and after, and I think they were swayed more by Solms than by Hobson. I think
yeah,
initially people started out with more of this neuroscientific,
yeah,
they felt it was more neuroscientific, but I think really were swayed a little bit more
yeah.
uh, by Freudian stuff,
I
surprisingly.
I remember that. I wasn't there, but I watched a video of that debate, and yeah, I that is how it came through. And it's a little bit like the neurorealism sort of inferential, that sort of sort of cognitive fallacy, in a sense that you can extrapolate from brain phenomenon to mind phenomena in a one-to-one way. That route is often more problematic, actually, than, in my mind, going the other way from mind phenomena or experiential phenomena to brain phenomena. Um, and so, yeah, Hobson took something neurophysiological and then projected it onto psychological statements.
I think you'll get a lot of agreement from both Joe and I on that. Yeah,
Okay.
that's a tricky thing to do. Yeah.
Well, thinking about getting back to psychedelics and thinking about brain states and how they map to psychological states and vice versa, um, maybe it would be good to just get your take a little bit on what are psychedelic drugs and what effects do they have on a person's psychological state, and then maybe just to tie it together a little bit about how it might be a window or a way to get
Sure,
at some
yeah,
of
happy
this
to
unconscious
go there. Yeah, I mean the
processing.
term itself was coined in I think 56 or 57 by Humphrey Osmond, psychedelic, conjoining two ancient Greek words, psyche for soul and then delic for to reveal or make manifest. Um, and 56, 57, by that time, we've got mescaline and actually the coming up with the term psychedelic happened through a really well part of the story involved a dialogue between Aldous Huxley, who had been turned on, the British author, uh, Brave New World, um, had been turned on to psychedelics mostly through Humphrey Osmond, it seems. Osmond provided Huxley with the mescaline that Huxley took and then wrote about in the famous essay, The Doors of Perception. Um, and we've got mescaline, we've got found in, certain cacti, peyote and San Pedro. Um, and then we have LSD, psychoactive properties discovered by Albert Hofmann in 1943. And we're on the cusp, I think, of the discovery of psilocybin and salicin in psilocybe mushrooms. Let's see, I think in the 50s, called Magic Mushrooms in a Life magazine article. So, you have two compounds now that are thought of kind of as prototypical psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, salicin as the active metabolite, coming on the scene at more or less the same time, very close in time to the term psychedelic being coined as psyche revealing, soul revealing, mind revealing. And then, yeah, sure, mescaline's a little older, but it made famous by Aldous Huxley's essay, again written at a similar time. So that was a really hot period for psychedelics. I've given you some examples there of prototypical psychedelics and also the etymology of the term itself. Um, and the term itself hints at the psychological properties or phenomenology of the psychedelic experience, and also will bring us to the psychodynamics of things, in terms of revealing the unconscious. Because if the psyche is entirely visible, then we couldn't have a compound, an intervention, a perturbation that reveals the psyche, because it should all be revealed to us.
Mm.
Ridiculous title book was written uh, in recent years called The Mind is Flat, that basically said there's no unconscious, and it's just nonsense. And I think psychedelics offer, scientific tools to demonstrate that very clearly, that the mind is far vaster, uh, deeper than we otherwise realize if we only have the vantage of normal waking consciousness. So the mind certainly is not flat. Um, yeah, so there we have some properties, some things said that are kind of poetic, but we also have uh, some pharmacology that we're aware of, and I guess some clarity on the pharmacology really took an advance in the 1980s when it was discovered. We knew for a while that these compounds hit the serotonin system. We just didn't quite know how precisely. But in the mid 1980s, a paper was published that plotted the relationship between the affinity of a range of different candidate psychedelics for a certain serotonin receptor. At that time, it was just called the serotonin 2 receptor. In time, we realized it was the serotonin 2A receptor, because there's also a 2B, a 2C. But it's the 2A receptor. So the stickiness, the binding potential, the affinity for this particular serotonin receptor correlated very reliably. I'm not quite sure what the correlation coefficient is, but it's like something like 80%, like solid principle with the potency. And that rule for 2A has stuck as a solid cornerstone of the pharmacology of psychedelics. It was added to in the 1990s in a significant way by Franz Wollenweider, when he showed that using a antagonist or a blocker of that very same receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor, could abolish a trip, a psilocybin trip. And since then, similar things have been shown with other blockers and other psychedelics in humans, and then in other animals where we have like a behavioral index of the animal tripping. It's a bit messy, not super reliable, but they shake their heads. Rodents do when they're given a psychedelic, and that's thought to be a readout of the psychedelic action. Um, but anyway, so we have these classic psychedelics, and we add that qualifier of classic, really to talk to compounds like mescaline, especially LSD and psilocin, that are direct um, agonists at the serotonin 2A receptor. An agonist is a drug that stimulates the receptor as opposed to an antagonist that blocks the receptor. So I've said a few things about the psychology, the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience, revealing the psyche, revealing the soul. Talked a bit about the etymology, where the term itself comes from. We talked about some examples of classic psychedelics, mescaline, LSD, psilocybin, psilocin, also DMT in ayahuasca, and also their pharmacology, that these are all compounds that will stimulate the serotonin 2A receptor. Now, recently, people have wrongly, in my view, attempted to crisp up or dial in our definition of psychedelics by saying we can define them as serotonin 2A receptor agonists. I actually think that's problematic for a few reasons. Some people think and believe they've shown that you can stimulate the 2A receptor and not produce psychedelic effects. I'm not entirely convinced of that yet. I think there might be more to the story that could explain some of the findings there. But even so, it's way too brain centric. You know, a colleague of mine said to me once, Pedro Mediano, computational scientist and polymath, that the brain is only as interesting as the mind. You know,
Hmm.
the brain is only interesting as the mind. It all starts with mind and experience. That's why we're interested in psychedelics, because we know that their psychological effects are so, you know, damn interesting and weird and kind of unique. But if we only knew that they hit a serotonin 2A receptor, you know, particular receptor, so what? So what? You know, it all really comes down to the the experience, and so that's why I think a definition of psychedelic it's essential that it refers also to the phenomenology.
So that the phenomenology and the neuroscience are correlated, but we take the phenomenology as being primary, or that's what we care about first. Is that?
Well, personally, I would use like a two-dimensional definition. I do think speaking to the brain can be helpful in terms of 2A agonism, but but we also know that that produces a psychological effect, an experiential effect, a subjective effect that is captured by the term psychedelic, psyche revealing. Um, and maybe, and I know this is of interest to Joe, we can probably all of us we can induce psychedelic states through other means. We think,
Right.
and so maybe I'm sort of thinking on the spot. You know, should we be so committal to say that there is a principal component? There's really one dimension at the core, and it is the phenomenology.
I like that way of stating it. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So that's great background on psychedelics, and I think uh, moving that forward in time a little bit, thinking about some of the recent findings and some of the work that you've done and your colleagues and others in the field, demonstrating that there can be real benefits for some psychological disorders, particularly for classic psychedelics. There's really good research now in depression. Um, it's maybe not obvious that you take the perspective that you were talking about from the 50s and 60s, and and forward, that there would be such a benefit. And so it'd be useful to kind of get your thoughts on what the evidence that you see today that
Mm.
psychedelics may have this benefit, and maybe a little bit also we can get into
Sure.
how that
Yeah, I mean,
happens.
there were bits of evidence being picked up in the 50s and 60s. It's just the methods weren't what they are today. We used scales that weren't really scales. They were just sort of questions about degrees of improvement. And then over time, we realized, in a sense, the science of psychometric evaluation, standardization, and construct validation, all this stuff, um, where we get, scales that are sort of quite well calibrated between each other, and so we know how to measure something like depression and its improvements. But that's still a work in progress, absolutely. But at least we're quite a bit further along with our metrics than where we were in the 50s and 60s, where people were doing studies, they just weren't very good. And another thing that happened around the
Hmm.
60s, I think early 60s, was that the gold standard method for assessing the efficacy um, of a medical treatment started to become established, the double-blind randomized control trial, and it happened at a time where the potential adverse effects of psychedelics were being highlighted in the 60s, and psychedelics didn't fit this testing model very well. So there was a kind of perfect storm that led to people starting to think that there wasn't a compelling evidence base for psychedelic therapy. Now, fast forward to the present day when we have better methods, better trial designs, and we've started to employ those in the context of psychedelic therapy research. And it's difficult to know quite where to start. There was we call it an open label trial done with psilocybin therapy for OCD, published, I think, in 2006. Um, Francesco Moreno was first author. He doesn't always get the credit he deserves because that was the first clinical trial of the modern era. Um, we had another very impactful, important study by Roland Griffiths and colleagues at Hopkins in 2006 that looked in healthy volunteers. They were theology students, I think. I think they were psychedelic naive or mostly, so they'd never had a psychedelic experience before. Given psilocybin, they have these profound, mystical type experiences. Rate those experiences as being among the most personally meaningful of their entire life, and that makes a big splash. And then we go into like 2011, something like that, with Charlie Grobe publishing on psilocybin therapy for end of life distress. This was a placebo control study, I believe, and published in American Journal of Psychiatry. Um, Small study, but promising, with drops in depression scores and anxiety scores in this population. Um, that gets a little glossed over as well. We tend to focus a lot on I suppose the Hopkins work, but Francesco Moreno and Charlie Grove, very important early papers there. Uh, let's see now. I guess in my own filter bubble at Imperial College London, we published on the first trial in depression, psilocybin therapy for depression, in 2016. That was an open label trial. Open label means patients know what they're getting. There's no blinding. So design wise, it's less rigorous than a blinded study where you don't know what you're going to get and it could be a placebo. Um, but these can be good designs for sort of finding your feet, demonstrating feasibility, demonstrating that this is safe enough to do in a very vulnerable population. That population was they had treatment-resistant depression. So they'd failed a bunch of different treatments for their depression. Some had very severe depression. Um, and so, while these days it's only a few years on, 2023, but then, 2014, 15 is when we're starting to do the work and proposing it at the time to the UK Medical Research Council as a grant proposal that we won. That's around 2012. It's I think it's fair to say, quite a daring thing to do, and a fair degree of uncertainty about whether indeed it was safe. You could
Mhm.
imagine all the fear um, around psychedelics, and do they induce psychotic disorders, and all these concerns about the safety. Um, some modicum some degree of concern in our minds, very genuinely, but also serious concern in terms of IRBs, the ethics committees that need to approve the study for us to even do it. Of course, the Medical Research Council in the UK, which is like the UK NIH, assessing whether they want to give £500,000 British pounds to this study. um, so we managed to do it. We managed to pull it off, and we published the paper in 2016 with quite a modest title, around I think it was assessing the feasibility of psilocybin therapy in treatment-resistant depression. It might have been proof of principle or something like that. So that gave people confidence, but it was also happening at the time that Hopkins and NYU were looking at depression, depressive symptoms in end-of-life anxiety, with two bigger studies that were placebo-controlled, that were also, I think, published in 2016 as well, albeit a few months later. And that started to be like, I always think of an auctioneer with his hammer. That was like, boom, we've got something solid now. Not just an open label study, but yeah, the open label study was good because of the clarity on the population. This was treatment resistant depression. It was definitely everyone had depression, DSM diagnosed. In the end of life anxiety work, it was a bit smudgier because not everyone necessarily met criteria for major depressive disorder coming in. But it was but they were very well designed studies with the placebo controls. So, the combination brought a real kind of, hammer blow of evidence. And since then, it's just been, in a sense, more of the same, but better, bigger studies, um, and clearer evidence. We did a trial published in 2021. Now, we're getting papers into the very top journals. This is the New England Journal of Medicine, which was a double-blind randomized control trial in major depressive disorder. So not as specific as treatment-resistant depression, but more general, if you want, bog standard depression, major depressive disorder.
Let me jump in for 1 second. So I mean, you brought up the issue of controls, and obviously it's going to be pretty easy for a participant to know whether they got, a strong dose of psilocybin or nothing, right? So how does that play out in it? And it's different, of course, than say control for an SSRI because it's not obvious. It may not be as obvious to the person that they got the
Mm,
dose. So how is that? How is that typically tackled in this research?
sure. Well, there's a few, like, well, myth might be a little strong, but misconceptions perhaps about things like, SSRI trials and the integrity of blinding. So just on that one, I think the evidence is something like 80% successful identification
Okay, so they do.
getting
The
on.
people in a lot of those trials really
Yeah,
do know
it's.
that they
I
got.
would say that's the myth, is that there is blinding integrity in clinical trials, in
Mm,
double-blind clinical trials, and all of a sudden we do psychedelic ones, and the blinding integrity is zero. I would say that in the psychedelic trials, the blinding integrity is very low. Most people can guess, especially when they get the psychedelic. Not everyone, but most.
mhm.
So sure, we're at, very poor blinding integrity. There are a few tricks we can do to try and maintain that, but people should realize that blinding integrity is a universal problem, especially in psychiatric drug trials. So don't think that this is a special problem with psychedelics. The other thing is that when you do, double-blind RCTs are a game we play. That sounds a little glib and is, but it is still what it is. Like when you're unwell, you go to your clinician and seek treatment, you get the treatment and you know what it is. And so it's an active part of the treatment action that you have your expectations and there's transparency on what you're getting. Now, the game we play in clinical research is to try and control for a potential confounding factor that we know is very potent, which is expectancy, positive expectancy. And you can call that the placebo response. It's really positive expectations carrying a positive response. But like I said, that's part of the naturalistic phenomenon that's always there. But in the game that we play in clinical research, we're acknowledging that that's a thing and then trying to tease apart, yes, but what's extra? Because if we didn't do that, you could sell snake oil. You could just, you could, and that feels ethically problematic. Like your treatment has to be more than just that positive expectation. Even though we know the positive expectation is a massive thing, really potent, we still need something more than that. So that's why we play the game. Now, the question is the double-blind RCT the only game in town to address that issue? I'm not sure it is. At the base of all of this is demonstrating that your treatment is more than snake oil. I know I'm being very glib in the language I'm using here, but more than just the positive expectancy action. So it's a mechanistic issue, action. It's the mechanistic action that we're trying to feel more confident about, knowing that there's a mechanistic action called the placebo response. There's a thing that happens there, a process that's mechanistic that causes you to get better, even though you're getting better through the psychology of the positive expectations, and that being wrapped up with, of course, biological changes that come with the, circular causality between mind and brain and body. But so then when you realize it's a mechanistic question, you wonder whether, yes, the double-blind RCT is the only game in town to elucidate what the extra is to psychedelic therapy in terms of its mechanistic action in getting people better. So you can do mechanistic work, and that could be things like brain imaging, it could be pharmacological blocking studies. So that's an important point to make. The other one is that if you believe that positive expectation is a major part of any treatment, which it seems to be, then you've got to assess it, you've got to measure it. So sometimes people get too stuck, in my view, on measuring the integrity of the blind, in my view, because they're very attached, in a sense, to this gold standard assessment of medical interventions, the double-blind RCT. So they assess the blinding integrity. There's a way to do that, which people haven't always done very well. But what they should also do is measure the positive expectations, or just measure expectations, because not all of them are positive. You can also have expectations about side effects. So you've got to do that. And I can tell you, we did that in our double-blind RCT, psilocybin therapy versus escitalopram for depression. This paper is, let's see now, has it been reviewed yet? It hasn't been reviewed, but it's being submitted. Balázs Szigeti is the first author. We found, as in the authors on the paper, this was a very hot one. Like there was some internal debate in the team, and I think collectively this was a fascinating paper we put together. But in no small part because the results are fascinating. So I'll try and describe them briefly. We assessed patients' expectations for each treatment. They didn't know what they were going to get. That's randomization. It's a coin flip, 50-50 chance you get psilocybin in this trial, or you get escitalopram. I'm just saying it.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
escitalopram is a SSRI, right? A typical standard kind
That's
of
right. Yeah. So some
depression
people would
medicine.
know it as Lexapro. It's a daily antidepressant pill that you'll take every day for, you know, X number of weeks or months to treat your depression. And in this particular trial, you took it every day for 6 weeks. You took a good dose of it as well. Um, so that was one of the arms. So at the start of the trial, we asked people, what do you expect in terms of degree of improvement for psilocybin, given your knowledge and expectations about that intervention? How effective do you think it will be? And they could do that. There'll be no change in my depression too. There'll be complete remission. Um, and they do exactly the same for escitalopram because they don't know what arm they're going to go into. We don't know what arm. It's before the coin flip, so they do it for both treatments. Then, of course, you know, the coin gets flipped and they go into one of the arms. And then at the end of the trial, we can assess how well they've done. And we can also track back now, knowing what treatment they had, and look at their expectations for that treatment and see if there's a relationship, you know. Maybe if you have really high expectations for psilocybin, you're the kind of person who's done fantastically well having received psilocybin. What we found was that that wasn't true. These are the results now. So there was no relationship
Hmm.
whatsoever. In fact, directionally, it was the inverse of the usual relationship. Um, so no relationship between positive expectations of efficacy or how well the treatment's going to do. We're focusing on psilocybin here. So positive expectations for psilocybin and actually how well you did. Like I said, directionally, it was actually in the inverse direction to what you would typically expect. So, meaning inflated expectations for psilocybin associated with slightly worse response. That relationship wasn't statistically significant, but it directionally, again, repeating myself, it was the opposite of what we're used to. Now, with escitalopram, it was exactly what we're used to. Higher expectations, better response, solid across the board for all the measures. So it was a fascinating finding because this has been a specter that sort of hangs over uh, psychedelic therapy, which is people saying things like, oh, they're super placebos. It's all placebo response. There's no integrity to the blinding. Well, there may be very poor blinding integrity, but now I'm sort of willing to say, do you really think it's compelling that psychedelics are snake oil, that there's no active action to this treatment in improving people's um, core pathology? I don't buy it. I don't buy it. And there's no compelling evidence to suggest that. And this particular result supports that.
Now, in terms of expectations, of course, if you've never had psilocybin before, your expectations might be based on who knows what, right? Media exposure or something like that.
Yeah, Michael
Uh,
Pollan's book.
right, Michael Pollan's book, right? Exactly, how to change your mind. Yeah, um, but then you might have, I guess, you might have different expectation. Maybe this is hard to say, but you might have different expectations after taking the drug, right? Your expectations about what's happening might be different than I guess you had expected. So after taking the drug, you might think, "Oh, initially I didn't expect anything, but now I do expect there to have something to have happened." Does it matter that it's just an expectation before ever taking the drug, or and I guess another thing might be if people are more familiar with it, people repeat users might have different expectations because they have
Mm.
something more realistic to ground it to.
I think that's a good point. And it's that expectation is a dynamic thing. It's also
Right.
locked in a process. So you have expectation prior to any intervention, but then you receive it, and all of a sudden you have an action, and you're attributing, you know, there's this complex causal interaction between changing expectations, actual effects that you're perceiving. So it's just difficult to tease apart the causation once you start having some actual action as well. Yeah. I guess the cleanest
Yeah.
way to do that is you've got expectations pre any intervention, and that's the result I was reporting.
It is tricky stuff. But also, I think also, I mean, one of the things speaking in favor is I think, as you sort of mentioned, the effect sizes that you're seeing pretty large effect sizes on a lot of these, and even especially compared to standard SSRIs. So that
Yeah, I think that matters, and we could talk that through a little bit. Um, if you have absolute outcomes, and absolute outcomes is just something like how many people in your population that you had in your trial are now in remission.
Mhm.
Let's imagine an extreme scenario. Everyone's in remission. You did an open label trial, everyone knew what they were getting, and now everyone has 0 on their depressive symptom severity rating scales. Um, if you're being really strict and faithful to the double-blind RCT, you would say you can't infer that the intervention in your trial caused everyone to have absolutely 0 depression now. This is a toy example, and
Mhm.
we don't have an example of something quite like this, but it's an extreme example to make the point. If you had fantastic absolute outcomes, do you not still have fantastic absolute outcomes? I mean, you could be left saying, well, this is just an example of the super snake oil effect. Um, but another part of you would be like, well, we're not used to seeing everyone hit remission. These outcomes are really exceptional, and there aren't many treatments out there that can work as well as this. So that kind of way of thinking has come into this because we do look at absolute outcomes. We say things about electroconvulsive therapy, like very controversial intervention over, the time, and wrapped up with, cultural associations through things like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But if you look at absolute outcomes, very effective for reducing depressive symptom severity, electroconvulsive therapy. Um, and so you are left with people making statements in psychiatry like ECT is, one, if not the most effective interventions for depression. You don't say it's the best because people don't like it. It
Mhm.
puts you into a seizure and all the, you know, um, other sort of side effect issues in terms of like cognitive negative impact on cognitive functioning and yeah, some other things. Um, but what I'm trying to say is that we do make inferences on absolute outcomes, and can we do that with psychedelics? Well, if we do it about ECT and we do it about other things, then maybe we can make those inferences. And so what kind of things can we say about the absolute outcomes? Well, there have been 3 investigator-led studies in major depressive disorder that have found 70% response rates with one or two interventions at the primary endpoint, at the place where you stick your flag and say, this is the main time since intervention that I'll assess how effective it is. Imperial, Hopkins, and Yale have all done psilocybin therapy studies in major depressive disorder that found 70% plus or minus a few.
And this is in people with somewhat intractable depression, really difficult cases.
Uh, just bog standard depression.
Well,
So
okay.
it's not treatment resistant depression. This is major depressive disorder. But typically, to do a trial like this, you do have entry criteria of at least moderate severity depression coming in. So I think the fairest thing to say is this is sort of a generalized, quite a general quality of depression. And then 70% response, where response is a halving, at least a halving of your baseline scores at that primary endpoint, where you've stuck your flag, say 6 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks after the intervention. This is where I'll assess 70%. Now that's good as an absolute outcome. It's quite a bit better, maybe about 20% better than what we're used to with SSRI trials in depression, and it's close to what you see with ECT actually. Um, so that's one thing. Now, investigator-led trials are well, they don't have industry bias because they're investigator-led, as opposed to like industry-sponsored. So these are all people like me designing a study, yes, getting a drug from somewhere, but not being pressured in any particular way by the drug company, just doing your science. So those are the investigator-led studies that I'm talking about. Now, drug company sponsored trials have been done in depression as well. You have Compass Pathways have done a phase 2b study in treatment-resistant depression. So that's the more intractable depression. And then you have USONA, who are a interesting sort of not-for-profit that have published on psilocybin therapy for major depressive disorder, but not a small investigator-led study, a multi-site study, something like 100 patients in that trial. There they had different assessment criteria, stricter than the ones I've been telling you about. Their assessment of response, this is a little granular, maybe too much for your listeners, but their assessment of response required that halving of your score at every single assessment time point up to the primary endpoint. So it was quite strict. And when they did it in that stricter way, it dropped down to 50% response rates. But it's sort of, what do they say? Apples and pears or apples and oranges. Wasn't quite the same test. So
Mm, mm.
it's harder to compare that one. Compass, their efficacy rates were not as impressive as the investigator-led studies, maybe because it was a tougher population, maybe the quality of the therapy wasn't as good as in the investigator-led trials, maybe its quantity was a little less, and they only had one single dosing session. So there's a few reasons why I think the response and remission rates in the Compass trial were quite as impressive.
Just a brief pause to say that if you're enjoying the podcast, please spread the word to your friends and rate us on Apple Podcasts or whatever you're listening on. You can contact us at cognationpodcast@gmail.com, or you can check out our new YouTube channel. Just look up Cognation on YouTube. Thanks for listening. So if we get a little bit out of the weeds of some of the studies, it seems like, I mean, it's been fairly well established by now, and I think we've cataloged a few different psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, DMT, and there seems to be fairly compelling evidence by now, and I think a lot thanks to your lab and some other associated labs. So
I'll just jump in if it's all right,
yeah,
Rolf. Just
yeah.
to say that all of the studies I was referring to was psilocybin, and it was a bunch of people. I mean, we did 2 trials there in depression, and I guess the fairest thing and the most conservative and sober thing would be to say that the early results look promising rather than compelling. Depends
Okay.
who you ask. The public think it's super compelling. I think it's very promising. Sorry,
If
I
we
just
put
had
if we if we leave it, I think that's good. I think
Yeah,
it's a
no,
very measured
that's good.
response, and I
I
think
like that. I
you
mean,
obviously don't want to get ahead of anything, but I think by now there's some general consensus that there is something going on. So
absolutely.
so I think the next step is to talk. I mean, you've done quite a bit of thinking about the mechanisms and thinking about models that might explain what's going on. So maybe you want to get into how effectiveness of these psychedelics is working.
Yeah, sure, happy to. And this is, of all the topics, well, this is a really juicy one. I mean, there's a few favorites, but the actual action, how does this work, is probably my favorite topic and the thing that I think about most. And just to give an example as to why it's important, and it kind of comes back to that whole kind of snake oil thing a little bit. Um, People use examples like smallpox, and we were able to develop a effective vaccine that eradicated smallpox, at least in the West, through understanding its action. And And so that's why action matters. When we understand what something is, like imagine if COVID had happened and we didn't know what the hell it was, then gosh, the number of deaths would have been way greater than they were. I think it's fair to say. If you look at past pandemics with other viruses and how they've wiped out, even vaster populations. But by understanding what it is, you can then come in with a targeted intervention. Uh, so that's why it's so essential. And then you develop an intervention that is as on target as it can be with the least amount of off-target action. Where off-target can bring in side effects and not bring the desired, remediating action. So that's why it's really essential in the context of psychedelic therapy, because you need to know what's doing it. And if you don't, you're going to be sloppy and have a lot of off-target action. Maybe some of that off-target action's expensive, or maybe it brings side effects. So it's all about like being able to dial in your medical intervention so that it really does what you want it to do with minimal, not what you want it to do. So that's why it matters. Then we have a few ways to look at this, and this is where the hypotheses come in. And I'll share some of mine that I think are shared by a lot of people in this space, not everyone, but a lot. Most of the people doing the human research and who have done the human research in recent years share these assumptions that I'm going to share with you, which probably the main one is that this isn't about just a drug action. And the clue is in the name, psychedelic therapy. Some people go as far as to call it psychedelic assisted therapy or even psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. In my view, that puts a little bit too much weight on the other component, and sort of says you just have the drug that's pushing along the psychotherapy. I get that, but I think it's probably better principle to think of a synergy. The 1 + 1 = 3 in this context. It's not an additive thing, but a multiplicative thing. Maybe 3 + 3. It's not 3 + 3 = 6, but 3 × 3 = 9, kind of thing. You're getting more by bringing these things together. You have a drug that opens up the mind and the brain in their functioning, in such a way that gives you a window of opportunity for then adding in this therapy thing. You can call it psychotherapy if you want. We could call it contextual manipulation, because is, for example, music listening, which has happened throughout all of the trials. Is that psychotherapy? Well, we do have music therapy, but a bit of a stretch to say listening to music is psychotherapy. So let's call it therapy because it's less committal to one component of it, psychotherapy. Sure, very important, we assume, but too much emphasis. Psychedelic therapy, that combination where making the mind and the brain more supple, more sensitive, we can bring in plasticity here. And I would encourage people to go with a definition of plasticity, which is very generalized, which is close, if not right on, the dictionary definition of plasticity, which if you were to look it up would read something like the ability to be shaped or molded, which is more or less synonymous with malleability. So the ability to change, not change itself, but the ability to change is plasticity. We increase the ability to change, and we marry that with contextual manipulation that is trying to do a few things. It's trying to coax emotional responses, perhaps coax emotional responses with some sensory experiences like visions, sense of wonderment and awe and exploration, confrontation. And we're marrying that, yes, with good, solid psychological support. We could call that psychotherapy if you want. and it'll be there ahead of time to help prep and prime people for the right kind of attitude and willingness to explore and go into the experience. Um, and then we have that psychological support to hold the individual, give them a sense of trust and safety in the experience itself. Um, and then have some aftercare, which is giving space and time for integrating what's come up during the experience, so that people can make sense of it, start to plan healthy behavioral changes. Um, yeah. So it's that combination, and the assumptions that we hold at the moment are that it's a synergistic combination. It's not just additive. There's a bit of evidence out there that you get a bit of an additive improvement with, say, a course of SSRIs in depression plus some evidence-based psychotherapy like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. You'll get a slightly higher improvement bar or slightly lower decrease in symptom severity bar if you add the two. It's an additive thing, a little bit more. But with psychedelic therapy, we're assuming, we're hypothesizing that you get a lot more when you put these two things in combination. And that's why we think it's potentially quite a, quite an advance on current treatments. Now, there's a lot more I could say about markers of, say, that plastic action. Most of the markers that we think of in terms of neuroplasticity come from rodent work and sort of bench work, looking at cells in dishes and sometimes looking in living animals with optical imaging and so on. Very, very interesting, very important. The markers in humans are less nailed down. I can share that we have some promising markers, some functional in terms of changes in brain activity that we're now seeing can predict improvements in mental health outcomes downstream. So we see the change in activity acutely under drug using recording devices like EEG. You see that effect, and then the bigger the magnitude of that effect, the bigger the improvements in mental health outcomes downstream. That particular metric I'm referring to is a measure of signal complexity or entropy. It's the randomness or statistical complexity of the signal across time and in space. So the more complex that signal, the richer that signal, the harder to predict that signal, the bigger is the effect, and that correlates with the intensity of the actual experience. The bigger the trip, and now we're seeing also the bigger the improvements downstream, albeit in healthy volunteers so far. And yes, unpublished, but a work in progress. I call that the entropic brain because the signal complexity is more or less, well, it is synonymous with entropy in the informational or statistical sense, as the it's easy to say random, the randomness of the signal, but perhaps a better way, more accurate way to say it is that we're uncertain about the signal or the phenomenon if it's more entropic. It's harder to predict across space and time.
In some sense, it's related to information as well, right? So
Yeah,
how much
because if
information is
you've got
carried.
a single coin with, two sides, that will give you very little potential information because it can only either be a heads or a tails. But if you have a system with a huge, repertoire of potential states or substates, then the potential information that you can get from sort of decoding that system is way vaster than a simple coin with two sides. So yes, it's sort of is very closely related to the potential information that you could get.
I think we've talked about this on a podcast before in relation to the idea of criticality too. That as you approach criticality, you're increasing the information and increasing and approaching more chaos at that certain inflection point too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think your theoretical work on this, Robin, is so interesting because it brings together these domains of complexity theory, some of these neuroscientific measures, EEG, fMRI, and then at the intersection of psychedelics and psychopathology. So it's bringing together a lot of really interesting, exciting pieces of what's the current state of
Yeah,
the art in neuroscience right now.
I hope so. Yeah, I mean, people have said that maybe information is sort of the most fundamental thing. Physicists have said this in the universe, underneath, matter or energy, or is at the most basic, it's sort of information, or in meaning in the statistical sense, bits of information.
Yeah, and I, just thinking about how in your work, particularly your paper on canalization and plasticity and psychopathology, you posit this notion of a single factor for psychopathology. In other words, that you can kind of reduce down how
Mm,
psychopathology develops
mm,
into a single factor. And it would be great to hear from you, like how you think about that and how that relates to the action of psychedelics and the
mm,
entropic brain, as you say, because I think it's maybe not obvious to someone coming from the outside that you know uh, increasing the entropy on it, or the randomness or like complexity of brain function would
mm.
actually lead to benefit. Maybe that sounds like something you might
Yeah.
associate with actually a negative outcome, but I think your theory pulls it together
Mm.
a really
Well, I
interesting
hope
way.
so. I hope it's useful. Yeah, I mean, you think of an entropic mind or brain, and you might think psychosis. You might think, oh, chaos in the mind and the brain. That sounds like madness. And I wouldn't walk that back. I would say, well, it may well be that during an acute psychotic episode, in a florid psychotic episode, you would see an increase in brain entropy. Yeah, yeah. But is a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia always, does it always look like that? Or does it often look like someone, who's retreated from the world, who's developed some fixed illusions, who in a sense, rather than being in a hot state, is in a very cold state? Um, and so it's very state specific psychotic disorders, I think. And so, yeah, so there's that. Something like depression is more obviously a cold state, and yeah, I am using the analogy of temperature here, but it sort of works. You get frozen in a substate. Again, retreat from the world, retreat from things that used to give some pleasure or um, engage some interest, and sort of stuck. Um, and this stuckness is what's at the heart of this canalization idea, where canalization was a term introduced to me through Carl Friston, um, the neuroscientist, and then I went down the rabbit hole of looking into this thing, and found Comrade Waddington's work on energy, on the epigenetic landscape, where he presented this now famous, at least in science, Waddington landscape, which looks like a kind of descending sort of mountainscape with valleys, and then you have balls that get stuck in the valleys, and that's the canalization. But there's actually an even more interesting geeky history here, where the origin is Henri Bergson of
Mhm.
Elan Vital, and other interesting ideas, who introduced the analogy of the canal. The canal is something cut into the earth, where the dynamics in that system are all one way. There's no freedom. All the water's got to move in this particular direction, enforced by the constraints. Now, it was Norman Whitehead, the philosopher, also talked about canalization, inspired by Henri Bergson. But Waddington picked it up in the context of um, genetics and epigenetics, phenotypic development, where it was basically saying, properties of an organism, phenotypes, can get stamped into our genome in such a way that they don't change from generation to generation. We typically have two arms and two legs and so on. And that's an example of certain properties that get canalized, that get stamped in. Canalization formally is the inverse of plasticity. So rather than being the ability to be shaped or molded or to change, and how that is going to interact with environmental pressures, where if you're very changeable or very malleable, what's happening in your environment is going to have a more exaggerated influence on you. That's plasticity. Canalization is a resistance to change. Now things have become entrenched and stamped in, where whatever happens in the environment, you're going to have two arms and two legs or what have you. So I used that theme. Carl put me onto it. I can't quite remember what the original seed was that he gave me. He certainly gave me the term to then go and look up. But I could see that could apply to psychopathology, and a lot of it, whether it's depression, where you get stuck in a negative cognitive bias, you retreat from the world very generally, retreat into your head, or eating disorders, anorexia, the caloric control, you get stuck on that, obsessive about that. Or addictions, where you get stuck on some object of relief, a drug, for example, and there's craving for that thing. And so your repertoire of potential state space is now constrained into, I just need to gamble or get the drug or get a drink. To, let's see, obsessive compulsive disorder, where these intrusive thoughts, I just need to clean my hands, or it's just it's compulsive. To specific anxiety disorders, I guess social is quite general, but if it's a phobia, it's very specific. And so again, there's a constraining of the state space around whenever I encounter whatever it is, it's just an overwhelming, terror. So all these things are characterized in a sense by an overlearning. And this is I think, an important twist, because, when we're taught in neuroscience, we're often taught about the Hebbian plasticity, the associative plasticity, and how it's the cornerstone of learning. And we tend to think, oh, well, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. More of that. And we measure that, and we can measure that. And we can show, development in certain synaptic properties through these associative processes. But it's an interesting pivot to say that actually might be ill health in terms of psychiatric disorders, where there's a excess, there's an overshoot of Hebbian mechanisms for whatever reasons, and we could go there. Why does it happen? But I think it happens, and then we entrench in certain ways of thinking and behaving, and that becomes the problem. And that's the problem in, I would say, most of psychiatric disorder. Not all of it. Earlier on we talked about the hot state of a florid psychotic episode. There might be some other examples of exceptions to the rule, but all rules are rules. They're models. They're not necessarily true absolutely. They're just models that are designed to capture something, not everything. And so I think that's what I proposed in that paper, is that the principal component of mental illness is the entrenchment of certain ways of thinking and behaving, the canalization of thought and or behavior.
Yeah. So that's really intuitive. I think from my perspective, that you get stuck in certain ways of thinking, reacting to stimuli that become overlearned. We had back in 2006, I think it was, when we were doing cognitive training research, Michael Mersnick and Henry Manka and others, including myself, wrote about negative plasticity. This idea that you can really is fundamentally a Hebbian type of learning, which for those who aren't familiar with the idea with Hebbian learning, it's basically the idea that when there's associative learning in the nervous system, when two neurons are active at the same time, they tend to become associated,
Mm.
further associated in subsequent firing. So the colloquial phrase is
Yeah.
neurons that fire together wire together. So that's the Hebbian process. The idea that through this process of what might be in a certain moment adaptive response over time gets rutted into your use your term, canalized into a
Yeah.
negative overall response, and it becomes very difficult to dig your way out of that. And so our approach was to try to step by step through inverting that with positive plasticity, using more of a Hebbian approach, more of a learning approach, try to dig your way out of that. And there's some interesting research in schizophrenia, for
Yeah.
example, using that approach, which has
Yeah.
been shown to be somewhat effective. But the approach of psychedelics
Yeah.
is rather different, and the plasticity that is implied by that
Yeah.
is is
Yeah.
is quite
I
different.
guess, in a psychotherapy like cognitive behavioral therapy, it might be something like, weaken this bad association, strengthen this association. And so it's still maybe somewhat Hebbian. You're trying to depotentiate the negative thing and potentiate a different positive thing. Like just say self-esteem, how to look at yourself, depotentiate the negative way of looking at yourself and potentiate a positive way. I guess psychedelics are very generalized in their action on plasticity. It's a very generalized pro-plasticity effect is how I see it, where it's all about the potential for change. And then you realize why it matters, what you twin with that window of elevated potential for change. It's like essentially important.
So this
Um,
is a I just so this is a great so this is a great point. So the idea so just the pure idea that what psychedelics are doing is increasing plasticity. What are the parameters around something like that? Because I don't think you would want to take LSD and then go work on your tennis game, right? Because there are probably certain things that it's useful for changing, for I don't know, decanalization or whatever you would,
mm,
flattening out some of those
mm,
canals, or reshaping that landscape a little bit. But also, when if you're on LSD, you're probably not in a state of mind to be changing just any random thing. It's a very particular state. So what are the parameters around plasticity here? What sorts of things is the mind ready to change and
yeah.
learn?
Well, it's a great question. I think, the first thing to go to is dose. Um, and there it's possible, at least it's theoretically possible, that you could take a low dose and work on your tennis game or some
Right.
other habit
And
and
I'm sure
actually
that's the promise for people who are microdosing, is the idea
quite,
that you can gain some of this brain plasticity without being interfered with
yeah.
mentally.
Yeah, and I think, as a colleague of mine, Adam Ghazali, had said, it's like he used the analogy of steroids. You don't just take the steroids and expect to get big. You take the steroids and twin it with the training. And it's a similar thing with microdosing. I think it then dawned on me that absolutely that's so true. It would be, it's sort of a training opportunity. And that's still theory. It hasn't been tested, but that's what rings true in my mind. You could take the low dose, the dose would be not so high that it knocks out function in a generalized way, and you get that generalized deficit confound where you
Mm.
just can't function because
Right,
you're too
right, right.
high, you're
Yeah, yeah,
tripping balls.
yeah.
But if it's a little bit, maybe you could feel more in your body when you do your golf or your tennis and start picking up on some of the skills that you were picking up on, but now with a little bit more malleability in the body and the mind and the learning apparatus. And so it's a very juicy idea. and let's see where it goes. But I would love to do a trial there. Of course, all these things are funding dependent, um, and I can't do that right now. But someone should and will do a trial around microdosing and training.
But thinking about, you were talking about
Yeah.
microdosing, but back to macrodosing in the context of a therapeutic setting, you have this model that you're talking about called temp. And it would be, I think it's very interesting, the relationship between, taking a moderate to high dose of psychedelics, and how, and this notion of entropy, and then how that relates to
Mm,
this
yeah.
landscape, this landscape that, and sort of
Yeah.
flattening of that landscape, if
Yeah,
you
and
will,
to call it
reducing
temp was
channelization.
intentional because it sounds like short for temperature. And in fact, the T is temperature by entropy mediated plasticity, I think it is. Uh, where it is, using that analogy of like heating something up so that you increase the br- the the energy in the system such that you can go from, say, a solid state to a more liquid state. And that's the idea with the macrodosing. It's a more dramatic liquefying in a sense of the system, such that everything's uncertain now, like even the very core um, sort of model or assumption that we have in our minds during normal waking consciousness, as exemplified by a use of the personal pronoun I, that starts to break down too, and that's ego dissolution. So, in a sense, it all breaks down and everything is uncertain. And, in that chaos, eh, that's really capturing part of the essence of the psychedelic experience at these macrodose ranges. And those are the doses that we're using in the psychedelic therapy. And sure, that sounds a bit like madness. That sounds like some kind of delirium. That doesn't sound nice and it doesn't sound good. I think often it's not nice. You know, these drugs aren't self administered by animals, they're not classic hedonic drugs. People don't take them because they feel really good in some simple way. Like they generally feel good if they have a drink, or they would have something like a stimulant or an opiate. It has that sort of valence bias that it tends to feel good. I don't think so necessarily with psychedelics. I think they're quite valence non-specific, and if anything, they're more aversive than hedonic as drugs. Um, but yeah, so that said, everything's breaking down. Everything's breaking down, and there lies, there it starts opening up some uncertainty in my mind, to be honest, about the next frontier in understanding action. The entropic brain was characterizing that breakdown of stuff. I introduced this thing called relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, or rebus, which is again about the breakdown of stuff. It's about our confidence in our assumptions breaking down. And it says that goes hand in hand with the entropic effect. Entropic effect happens, and that looks like this drop in our confidence. Um, and to use the language of Bayesian um, inference. It's the precision weighting of the priors, which is a fancy way of saying something which is way more accessible. It's our confidence in our beliefs. And that confidence decreases, so relax beliefs under psychedelics. Just an effort to make it more understandable to more people. It's the same principle. So these are breaking down things, but there's that very interesting question of, is that all the psychedelic state is? Um, or as Carl Jung says it, in all chaos, there is cosmos. In all disorder, a secret. In all disorder, a secret order. That's him being very poetic about this principle. As things break down, stuff can come up. And again, I don't think we'd have a different name for these compounds than psychedelic, psyche revealing, if all it was, the breakdown of stuff. It would be more like psyche, dissolving, but we don't call them that. So yeah, the cosmos in the
Yeah.
chaos is the thing that I'm fascinated about. Uh, how we might capture that. We measure. I think we measure aspects of this in some subjective ratings um, around things like psychological insight, where scores on psychological insight rating scales now seem to predict improvements in mental health outcomes downstream. Um, but in the brain, in the dynamics of the brain, what is that cosmos? What's that secret order that comes in uh, alongside the disorder?
One thing that occurs to me as we're talking about this now is, there's another analogy that we
Mm,
sometimes use, which is like shaking the snow globe, which is that same
mm,
idea of like creating this chaos in the brain and reducing your beliefs, making manifest the notion that you don't really know what things like what you are, like what the world
mm,
is, and what your relationship between you and the world. I mean, to me, that was the thing that when I discovered psychedelics, and well, at least certainly when I did LSD for the first time, what I discovered about myself was that my understanding of the
mm,
world was mediated through my senses. Simple thing, like Newton says, the rays to speak properly are not colored. Kant speaks about this as like,
mm,
you can't know the thing in itself. Um, but that
mm,
realization was so imminent for me that it
mm,
completely opened my mind to the world around me as being,
mm,
to question my assumptions about the world around me, and particularly the negative assumptions, but just in general made me more curious and open. So I wonder about this
mm,
concept of openness to experience as being like an opening. And this is something, as I've been talking with a lot of people in interviews recently about their moves towards better
mm,
approaching
mm,
their mortality and thinking about that. This idea of being more open to the possibilities as being actually
mm.
profoundly comforting in a way. Um, and so maybe there's something in that as
Yeah.
a linking principle, this idea of where how it can tend to be positive, although we can obviously also see in this conversation that
Mm,
it doesn't necessarily need to be positive, right? It
mm.
can definitely be
Well,
negative as we
there's a
know.
lot in that.
Yeah.
It's there's so much. It's hard to know now where to go. But yeah, that principle of our experience of the world being generated. Uh, you know, was it? Where did that quote come from? Sorry, was it? Yeah, it was Newton.
So Sir Isaac Newton. So my background is in color science, and,
Yeah,
and Rolf also did color perception. So we always
yeah. I mean,
go back to that one. But yeah,
yeah, the colors depend on our perceptual apparatus and yeah, I guess the wavelength of the light and all that kind of thing. It's in and of itself, they don't have that intrinsic property. It's all dependent on the how it's received by the perceptual apparatus. So yeah, and the hierarchical predictive processing model, this model of the brain and the mind as generating our experience of the world rather than receiving the world. We generate it actively. The so-called generative model um, is the same kind of thing. And another sort of simple way to put it is that in this handshake between world and brain, brain is dominating, or the top down is dominating. Again, to that principle that we're generating our experience of the world, we don't realize it until that generative mechanism breaks down in some way. And then when that happens, it's like, wow, didn't even know. I was blind to that one. Talk about a blind spot. And I guess that's the epistemic development or transformation that can come with psychedelics. It's like a knowledge that maybe you always knew, but you were blind to. And it's like insight through things coming down rather than things coming up, like, an earthquake knocking down, occluding structure so that you can see more. Um, So that might be a part of the clue, as like, the cosmos in the chaos. It's like, oh, with things coming down, there's like a flattening and an opening up. There's an opening up now. Um, and you know, so I think it may well be that. And then the opening up becomes, yes, it's a broader scope now. It's a broader scope now. It's less pinned down. We think of things like it's less entrenched. Um, and and it's like an open playing field or a blank slate. Um, I mean, there is this intriguing thing. I once heard it called by Dennis McKenna as the paradox of ego dissolution, which is that these drugs, psychedelics, can cause ego dissolution on the drug, but then it comes back with a vengeance. He was talking about like jumped up egos and that he was noticing actually in the psychedelic community, and so coined this term, the paradox of ego dissolution. I think it's quite good that so there's one system that, while yeah, sure, it breaks down under psychedelics dose dependently, um, and it's hard to find many interventions that can do that as robustly and reliably as psychedelics. Um, takes a lot of training and expertise to achieve that with meditation, for example. Um, but even with meditation, Jack Cornfield says this nicely. There are no enlightened people. I, there's one of his books, maybe After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. Such a powerful statement that he opens the book. There are no enlightened people, only enlightened states. So you can achieve that opening and the cleansing of the doors of perception, but you come down and they come back. You
Temporary.
better watch out. Yeah, and I think that's especially true of the ego. Just recently, I was listening actually to a podcast by the Santa Fe Institute, the Complexity Science Institute. There, very good podcast. I think it's just finished. Um, but the host was saying something very interesting about systems with memory, and systems with nodes that have a long memory or a deep memory are more stubborn and resistant to change. And it just made me think of the ego and the paradox of ego dissolution, that like that system is so deep. I tend to think that, I think a bit anatomically about the ego as well. I think of like the neuroscientists will be able to follow me on this, like the default mode network into the limbic system, into the medial temporal regions. And like that's a lot of the brain. And it's not just a lot of the brain in terms of brain mass in humans, but in evolution as well. That's like, yes, human brain into mammalian brain. That's a deep system. That's a deep system. So to think you're going to change that thing, dissolve that thing, and it not come back, well, you start to realize, of course, it's going to come back and find itself, um, and maybe we should be glad that it does, and otherwise, what are we left with? Maybe it's not sustainable. It's not healthy to inhabit a state of like permanent ego dissolution or something.
That does sound horrible. It does sound horrible to me.
Well, Rolf and I have an ongoing discussion about this, our views on our own
Right.
ego and whether we'd like it or not.
Not
I'm
me.
all for
I
ego
want to keep my
dissolution
ego.
and getting rid of it, but
I
Rolf is
really
identified
appreciate my ego.
with his.
Not getting rid of it.
But I think this gets into a couple other very interesting directions, both related to how psychedelics are impactful in the treatment of psychopathology. One is, I think, is just not really mentioned much in the literature, which is how much prior experience a person has with psychedelics and how efficacious the therapy will be. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I could think to some naturalistic research we've done where we use prospective surveying, so like just online questionnaires to track people before and after psychedelic use. And when we've done that, we have found that experienced people tend to have nicer trips, more positive trips. Uh, in terms of improvement, it's tricky because you get this ceiling effect where, you know, there's less scope for improvement if someone's well-being is already high. But we have found that they have more positive trips, more experienced people. So I don't know. We have done studies in entirely psychedelic naive people. We have seen, yes, we see some challenging experiences, but we have seen the big improvements in mental health outcomes. And actually, we've also seen some brain changes that are really exciting, even potential anatomical brain changes, which would be quite remarkable. And that's a draft that we're working on at the moment. Paper's gone through review, major revisions. We're coming out the other side, feeling good about it. Um, they could be microstructural changes in the white matter, in the cabling of the brain that happen after your first ever psychedelic experience, high dose psychedelic experience. Um, so yeah, I guess the naive brain and mind is fresher, maybe more sensitive to the impact of psychedelics.
Well, I think it also speaks to like this idea that we were just talking about of if there's this insight that this veil is lifted, now you can see
Mm.
something real about the world that you didn't know before. Once you've seen it,
Yeah.
now you know it. And like and you know, so you know, you talk about Roland Griffith's work and his finding
Mm.
that this is one of the most impactful experiences of someone's life,
Mm. Mm.
most impactful spiritual experiences of one's life. That's not going to I would
Mhm.
posit that that's not going to be the case the 12th
Yeah.
time they do it.
Yeah, maybe they might inch up a rank if it was a really big experience. But yeah, sure, there's less scope.
Right,
There
right,
is
right.
absolutely less scope. And it reminds me of the Alan Watts statement, once you get the message, hang up the phone. And yeah, the thing is you do forget, and this comes
Yeah.
in spiritual practice as well. Like you might hit something like a, enlightenment like state. With some profound meditation and some insights. But then you go back to ordinary samsara, waking consciousness and start falling into the old patterns and so on. So even though, sure, you might have the vision, it is very easy to forget. Um, People talk, yeah, in spiritual practice, it's more obvious that it requires a practice for the sustaining, for the
Yeah.
maintenance of the healthy changes or realizations that have come about through the experience. I have heard that term used in the context of psychedelics as well, as psychedelic practice. I guess the danger is that becomes psychedelic abuse or overuse, but it doesn't have to. It might just be quite sparing use of psychedelics when you fall into that forgetting state, or let's put it into the more concrete space of psychopathology. When you relapse into, say, depression or back to the addiction, it then makes sense to, in a sense, have the reminder of another psychedelic therapy session. Uh, yeah, but I think we're sort of orbiting around this principle of which maybe takes us full circle back to psychedelic and the definition psyche revealing that there's something of this action and of this therapeutic action when it's psychedelic therapy that could be characterized as epistemic, like it's an understanding, it's a knowledge thing, um, and that's maybe where the benefit rests.
Yeah, and then I guess the other related question then is around therapy. So, you know, we often talk about this idea of set and setting, and then of course within the context of a lot of these studies, there will be one or two therapists present during a dosing, and there will be, uh, you know, some kind of a therapeutic process associated with that. How do you think about that process in terms of, I mean, in some ways, if we think about the science of psychedelics as, you know, a psychological intervention, you know, there's work to be done on the molecules themselves, and there is a lot of work being done there. But it seems like a much uh, easier place to start, if you will, or yeah, I mean, another place to start would be how can we optimize the therapies, and does your work or your theorizing give you any directional sense of
Uh,
where to take that?
is a great point, and there are some ideas that we'll explore, um, and it brings in some of the practical considerations. In a sense, the harsh reality of medical interventions, and the medical system, and even more concretely, the cost of medical care, because we
Mm,
could imagine a kind of four seasons model where, yeah, you get the drug, but on top of the drug you overlay this like paradisical scenario, like, I don't know, whatever it is, the most heavenly sort of context that just is really enriched and and not just there for the session but extended in time, and you can have as many interventions as you want and as much psychotherapy as you want. But that's really the private payer model. That's the four seasons model that most people can't afford and can only dream about. And That's the harsh reality here, because in healthcare systems, whether it's an insurance based one or a public healthcare system, you have someone's got to foot the bill, someone's got to pay for the treatment, and so the treatment has to be affordable enough. Otherwise, they ain't going to cover it, and that's the reality. Like, insurers won't cover psychedelic therapy. That's a very real concern at the moment. So all the work could be done by your Maps or your Compass or your Sona or what have you. They get a license, and then insurance companies don't cover it because they just can't see how the sums can work up to make this affordable and coverable. Whereas SSRIs are really cheap, and yeah, easy to cover the costs of those. You don't need any psychotherapy. You don't need any professional staff time. So it's a real reality bite for this space. And what do you do with that? So sure, you can get creative and think of the four seasons model, and I've been doing that with some colleagues at UCSF, more specifically Neuroscape, likes of Adam Ghazali. We developed this really exciting nature immersion um, project with Louis
mm,
Schwartzberg and his amazing nature footage, and then East Forest and his beautiful nature-inspired music and sounds. And that combination is really beautiful. And yeah, you know, that that doesn't have to be expensive. It's an audio-visual thing that you can deliver through some medium, a decent enough sound system. But that's only going to be, say at the start and at the end of a psychedelic experience. But let's see now. Because of the cost and the harsh reality, technology could come in to help us there. And this is where there's a really interesting tension going forwards, which is that the purists, and I know this having had a bit of a background in psychoanalysis, you know, proponents of psychoanalysis think that we all need, maybe we do, I don't know, need is a strong word, but, regular psychoanalytic psychotherapy for many years to be a, well enough functioning human being. But of course, very, very few people can afford that luxury. So we don't have that. Instead, within a medical system, we have 6 weeks of CBT, um, and even that is a bit challenging to roll out at any scale and make available to large numbers of people. Hence, there's often long waiting lists to have even that kind of evidence-based psychotherapy through your insurance or through a public healthcare system. So we've got a challenge here, and how could tech help us? Well, I think there are some daring creative ideas around things like machine learning and VR, um, and providing an alternative to, I guess, an expensive human being and their many hours. Um, and this is where we're going. this is where we are going, whether we like it or not. It's similar with, say, vehicles. I mean, in terms of self-driving cars, they could massively improve road safety matters. Deaths and accidents on the road. But the thought of all the vehicles on the road being essentially like machine driven or robot driven is very frightening for many people. But is there space for some kind of machine intelligence coming into the psychotherapy space to help us out in terms of the cost of the cost problem with psychedelic therapy going forwards? I think, yeah,
Yeah, I mean the other the other piece of psychedelic therapy cost has to do with, in the model that is being developed now, is that it is being done in a medical setting, and this the setting itself is expensive. So like for example, a therapist, you know, depending on what kind of therapist it is, maybe not that expensive actually. Like
mm,
compared to other things that we're doing. But if you do it, especially in a hospital or even in a in that kind of a setting, and then you've got all the constraints around that,
yeah,
then it
yeah,
does
that
become
is
very
that is
expensive.
part of it. But
um,
then these places for healthcare do exist, and it wouldn't necessarily be expensive for them to retrofit around psychedelic therapy. Uh, yeah, and you still go to a hospital or a clinic to, I don't know, have a vaccine or have a lot of,
yeah, I guess where I'm going is you got this approach that's being done more underground, which is especially group based, kind of experiences where people come together around a ceremony, and that is still not cheap, but it's potentially
yeah,
considerably
cheaper. I just
less
wonder in
expensive.
a regulated system whether you could have that, but you still go to a licensed place. It's just within a regulated
Hmm.
system,
Hmm.
you bring in the regulations because you want to safeguard, and the checks and balances can be, you can feel more confident about them. And they're not going to be watertight, and things can still go awry, and there can be bad practice. But at least you have the regulation. You can be, struck off as a provider. Um, there is some oversight of this. Otherwise, if you leave it to Wild West, I think it's quite reasonable to expect that there'll be more cases of sort of bad practice and so the take-home psychedelic model is a very, very challenging one um, in terms of thinking how that could really happen in a system at scale. Um, I am a little skeptical that that's a real possibility going forward. But people who think that that's the way we need to go with this intervention are the ones who are thinking of stripping away the trip. Um, let's see how successful they're going to be. I'm a little skeptical on that, both for its efficacy and even if they get the efficacy, is there still a bit of the trip? Is that really going to be safe to take? Yeah, and are there subtleties around microdosing? And if you think you could strip away any kind of care, earlier on we were talking of like microdosing time, some kind of training. So can you actually get around the fact that you still need to twin the drug with something to get the right kind of safety and efficacy or benefit?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, as you're talking about that, it makes me think, you know, CBT, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, which can be quite manualized and delivered, with an app, for example, may be, an interesting twin for
Yeah,
an ongoing kind of
yeah.
therapy that,
And of course,
at lower dose,
in recent
for
years,
example.
catalyzed by the pandemic, we have this now. We do so much of our communication remotely, and so maybe some kind of video type therapy could be another workaround. I think there'll be a lot of these kind of compromises um, where um, yeah, it might not be the extreme of take home psychedelics, or certainly not take home macrodose psychedelics. People will still do that anyway. They'll skirt round the system and do what they want to do, as they're doing right now. Um, but at any kind of scale, within any kind of structured system, I don't see that happening easily, unless people go around the system.
Well, we want to be mindful of your time here, and we've been talking for quite a while, which has been fantastic. But I want to make sure that we uh, get to a question that we usually ask our guests, which is, "What are you excited about? What's coming up down the pike that you're excited to see, experiment-wise or regulation-wise, or anything?"
Sure. Well, I'm excited about a lot. I got a few exciting things going on. I've just launched my lab and a website for it, carhartharrislab.com. Nice to get that out. It's something I felt I had to do for a while. So it's not the best website in the
Uh,
world, but it's something. And I'll get a bit of help, and I'll improve it and enrich the content and so
it's
on.
very informative. I've been on it. It's
Oh,
super
thanks.
informative.
Well, I like that I put these harm reduction videos on there. For another project, I created those a few years ago, and um, a couple of years ago at least, and they hadn't got into the public domain. So I'm pleased to have got them in, and knowing that psychedelics, do
Do you want
carry
to
some.
say? Do you want to say something about the harm reduction videos?
Yeah, they're intended as sort of psychoeducation around psychedelics, and knowing that some tragic cases have happened recently with people procuring psychedelics themselves, illegally, having experiences, getting into trouble, sometimes tragic cases, loss of life, or- and and suicide as a cause. It really, really tragic. So learning of some of these cases and then just thinking these could have been avoided with better education. That was a strong motivation to just get these things out, um, even though it's vulnerable when you stick yourself out there. Some people could easily be like, "Oh, what? Why is he an expert on that?" I thought he was a neuroscientist. There's different things like that, and so I don't want to overclaim on the videos. Most of it's borrowed from other people. Whether psychedelic therapists like Bill Richards mentored um, me early on, and our team doing the depression work, and then um, I've had other mentorship as well, and then just borrowing from like wise people in spiritual practice. There's a lot of Thich Nhat Hanh in there, and Jack Cornfield, Stephen Batchelor, sort of secular. Um, I guess with the exception of those who are a little bit more religious, maybe with their Buddhism, it's generally quite secular. Um, yeah, and sort of wisdom teachings inspired. So it's there. It's take it or leave it. I don't overclaim. It's just there, and maybe it could be helpful for some people who want to learn about psychedelics and how to mitigate
We'll
potential.
certainly put some links up on this on with the show notes for that too.
Thanks. That's great. Thank you. Yeah, and I just completed a book proposal, which is going out. Just signed this morning for that, which is nice.
Very cool.
Beyond some of my theoretical work on psychedelics and mental health, the canalization model, more or less everything is going to be. I'm going to try and condense it into this book and
Oh,
give
we'll
it
be
a
on the lookout for that.
cool. It's probably a few years away from actually publishing and being out there for the world, but it's happening. And the other things, well, I'm doing a study now, dosing people, deep fMRI study. What does that mean? It means doing a lot of scanning within the same person, and not a lot of people, but going deep within given individuals, deep fMRI. We call it Insight 2. There was an Insight 1. So there's a giveaway there in that we're interested in the mechanisms of insight. Um, and we're trying to capture substates that arise within a psychedelic experience. The psychedelic experience was never one thing. Um, it has many different faces and some quite starkly different faces, as you know, captured by the doors of perception, heaven and hell. you know, um, so this could be quite an advance as things stand right now. We don't have a handle on questions like, what's a bad trip? What's going on in your brain and body when you're having one of those compared to like surfing heaven on a psychedelic. So I'm excited about that. I've also recently, just yesterday, connected with someone who's created a sort of large language type model for fMRI data, Brain LM. It's only just come out as a preprint, but I've reached out and I'm excited about having that call to see if we can use that training essentially to scrutinize our psychedelic data and to see what it'll say or see when it looks at those data. It may well say, I suspect, this is weird. I'm not used to this. This is novel. I actually, I felt that that's a thing that we'll come to for a while. Psychiatry embraced psychedelics in this so-called renaissance of the last couple of decades, psychedelic renaissance. Psychiatry was pretty quick on picking up on this and publishing in top medical journals. Cognitive neuroscience has been slower for whatever reason. But I think what might change things will be the novelty of the action, in a sense, the novelty of the data. Once people start realizing that you see things under psychedelics that are really unusual, you don't typically see that in human brain function. I think that's where there'll be a pivot and there'll be even more interest in the scientific community and psychedelics as scientific tools. And they'll start to realize why they're so important in consciousness science, for example. So yeah, excited about that study. Another study that it's underfunded, but it's an ambitious study to test the assumption that I was talking about earlier, that psychedelic therapy is a synergistic thing. It's more than the sum of the parts. And so to test that, you need a certain kind of design that will test for the synergy. And more specifically, you need 4 arms. You need to control for drug versus placebo, and you need to control for, in a sense, the therapy, no therapy, or enriched, unenriched. Enriched set and setting, unenriched set and setting. So you need those components to show that when you add in the drug and the enriched, it's a sort of multiplicative, additive effect. It's a big change on drug versus enriched versus unenriched, whereas on placebo, it's more or less kind of the same, not much change. So to do that, you need big numbers, and unfortunately, it's expensive, and we've got work to do there. But that's a good way through the approval process, so it's fast-tracked. We'd be able to start quite soon. But yeah, we need to raise some money to do it. So these things excite me. I love being at UCSF. It's ideal for me now. I love living in the Bay Area. So yeah, life's pretty good, to be honest. Yeah, I'm very lucky.
Well, Robin Carhart-Harris, thanks so much for joining us here. It's been a great conversation. We appreciate you spending so much time with us today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Just a brief pause to say that if you're enjoying the podcast, please spread the word to your friends and rate us on Apple Podcasts or whatever you're listening on. You can contact us at cognationpodcast@gmail.com, or you can check out our new YouTube channel. Just look up Cognation on YouTube. Thanks for listening.